Welcome to a special edition of GlugNet, Greater Lansing User Group for .NET. We are very excited and pleased to have Sarah Sadukie Dutkiewicz here with us tonight, and she's going to be talking about passwordless development and Azure Identity. Those are very, very important things. Azure is a growing platform, and getting the security right is very, very important. So I'm excited to see what she has to say. And it is not October 19th, I believe. I think we're a little bit
No,
past that.
today is November 1st. We were supposed to be on October 19th, but we had some
Yeah.
schedule issues, so we
Yep.
made this happen.
Yep. Schedule issues happen, and we're here, and that's what matters.
Yep.
So, just a word of background: Sarah and I have known each other for a very long time. We've been both active, very, very active in the .NET community for an extremely long time. I think we're in the period of decades now.
Yeah.
At least I
Yeah.
am.
Uh,
This is
15 years in this community this year.
Yeah, GlugNet turned 20 this year. So we are in our 20th year and we're celebrating that still. So happy GlugNet 20th.
Yay.
And I am in my 19th year of being on the board of directors for GlugNet. I joined in the beginning of the second year. So next year, April, I'll hit my 20th anniversary, which just goes to show I'm getting old. And but yeah, 20 years of leading this user group as of next year. So I'm excited about
That's
that.
impressive. That's a
Thank
long
you.
time.
It is a long time. I feel tired.
I understand that.
So as I said, this is the Greater Lansing User Group for .NET. We're based in Lansing, Michigan, or Okemos, Michigan, somewhere in that general area. Since we're virtual, it doesn't really matter. And we always hold our meetings on the third Thursday of the month. You're always welcome to join us. Meetings are always free. At this point, we're still virtual. We will investigate going in person, but honestly, virtual works pretty good, and we get a wider range of speakers, and I don't know. We'll see how that goes. We may just stay virtual for a while. I do miss the going out together afterwards, but not to say we couldn't still do that. So our URL is pretty easy to find, meetup.com/glugnet. And sponsors, we have some sponsors, NAS Technologies. Sam Nasser has been kind enough to sponsor us in the sense that he provides our meeting platform and records our meetings and places them on YouTube. We'll give links to that later. And we are actually being recorded at this time. So thank you, Sam. The .NET Foundation is also one of our sponsors. The .NET Foundation, it pays our meetup.com monthly fees, which we greatly appreciate. And we are very thankful to be a member of this foundation because obviously we are a .NET oriented group, mostly. We do have presentations outside of that. But we're just really, really happy to be a part of that foundation and to have them recognize us as a group that is valuable enough to be invited to join them. It will, as I mentioned, it will be recorded. So the link for that is pretty easy to find, youtube.com/@SamNasserMVP. And there's a QR code if you want to grab that, but it will be posted generally within a week. We don't push Sam too hard to do that right away, but he's pretty good about it. So, and not only this recording, but recordings of previous GlugNet meetings and also recordings of the Cleveland group, which he's the leader of. So it's a great place to go get some really good information and skill up on some things. And plus, wonderful banter before the meeting starts. Some of it may still be there.
Always.
And additional meetups in the area, I just mentioned Cleveland, which Sam runs. So there's a link for the Cleveland VB.NET user group, C#. There is the Greater Lansing user group for SQL Server, or called GLASS. They are on a somewhat intermittent meeting schedule, but they still meet. And if anyone has, you can go out to their meetup.com and see what's going on, or if you want, you can contact me and I will reach out to the organizer and ask any questions you may have about what they're doing. If you want to be a speaker, if you want to have a better idea what their future plans are, whatever, let me know. I can get a hold of them. And Sam runs a .NET study group in Cleveland, and that's at that link. And if you're interested in joining that, I think you can join virtually. So if you're interested in being a part of that and getting with others, that's really valuable. That's where you can actually ask questions live, like you're sitting in a study room and like in college, and learn from each other. So that's wonderful. And then, of course, mi.net is starting back up again. It was gone for a while. That's the Southfield, Michigan group, Greater Detroit. They are starting up. They were having a conference soon. I don't have the details on the slide here, but they will be hosting an in-person conference, so that'll be fun. In-person conferences are coming back. I've spoken at a couple. Sarah has, and I wouldn't say they're fully back, but they're coming back, and that's a great thing.
Is that the conference that's going to be at United Wholesale Mortgage?
Okay. Just be kind of in the northeast corner of the Detroit area, right?
I think that's MI TechCon.
Okay.
Let me get their website for you.
Yeah.
I'll post that in the chat, maybe. Let's see if that goes. So that's happening March 21st and March 22nd?
Of next year, I assume. Yep.
Yep. And early bird, it looks like 2 more weeks of early bird ticket sales.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, put that in the chat for sure.
Yeah. I'm not in Michigan. I'm in Ohio, but I am very well networked with the Michigan crew, so I'll gladly help find links as needed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just got invited to the Orlando, Florida Code Camp for next year, so they're going on.
Yep, that's Santosh, isn't it? Nice.
Yeah. I spoke there last year. I don't have a new talk, so I got to come up with a new talk.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally, we do ask that you complete a survey after this presentation and give your feedback to Sarah. Sarah, like all speakers, is very interested in doing a wonderful presentation. I know she will, but we all continue. There's this thing called continuous improvement that people like to follow, and I and Sarah and other speakers always want to do the best we can. So any feedback you can provide is wonderful. I put this link URL in the chat, and you have a QR code here if you prefer to use that. So please give feedback to Sarah. She will greatly appreciate it. And with that, I think we are ready for the feature presentation. So sorry for my little jumbled intro here. If you want, you can go to the presentation evaluation and just give her all 5 stars now, because I know Sarah, I know she'll do a great job, and that's a very safe thing to do.
He's hyping me up. No pressure.
No pressure at all.
No pressure. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah. Anytime. I'll look forward to return the favor someday, right?
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Dutkiewicz. I go by Sadukie in the community, so that's why I put my name on here as Sadukie. If you see me at user groups or at conferences, if you need to get my attention, I very rarely actually answer to Sarah. So that's why I go by Sadukie everywhere. That's my first name and last name. Trying to spell those out can get to be troublesome. So it was a nickname that I got back in 2004 and have carried ever since. I am a Microsoft MVP in Developer Technologies. I've been an MVP in Developer Technologies in C# for 15 years now. But I am not limited to C#. I'm a polyglot who loves just collecting programming languages. If there was an A&E Hoarders episode on programming languages, hi. I love looking at programming languages, playing with programming languages, and pushing them as best as I can. But by day, I deal with C#. Sometimes I have to deal with VB.NET for clients. I usually, truth be told, I use ChatGPT to help translate C# into VB.NET because that syntax hasn't settled in my head. I haven't done VB.NET professionally in a long time. Lots of cobwebs there. Did VB6, VB4, VB3, so I've been at this a while. But yeah, C# is where I'm at nowadays. So tonight we're going to talk about the problems with credentials in development in general, let alone in Azure development. I'll point out some alternatives, but the main star of the show is going to be going passwordless. So we'll talk about Azure Identities SDK for .NET. We'll look at my friend's default Azure credential and chain token credential. And this agenda shows demos, and more demos. I'm going to show a C# demo, but then I have links to the Java, the Python, and I think the JavaScript demos as well. I'm not going to run those tonight because there's just so much we can focus on, but I will include the slides, and I'll make the slides available to you all after the meeting, so that way you have the links for those as well. And then that way, if you want to play with Python or with Java or with JavaScript, you can. Now, think about this. Where do you store your passwords when you write applications? How many of you have seen this with the app settings, thinking like your .NET framework, .NET 4 stuff? How many times we used to do this because that's all we could do? Nowadays, there's no reason for doing things like this. I mean, there are much better ways to do it. So there's secrets and using a secret config file and adding those to your git ignore so they don't go into your repos. How are you loading values into your environment? Are you using environment variables? Environment variables are okay, but the problem is, do you have a script that loads your environment variables? Do you check that script into your source code as well? Are your credentials leaking that way? The secret manager is a way for you to get around storing your credentials, but keep in mind with the secret manager, it's only for development purposes. You don't want to use it in production, and it's not encrypted. All right, so where are you storing your passwords? It's probably in the past you might have been doing something like this. That's a good way for things to get leaked. But Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault's a good spot to store some of these things. So you're not checking in your Twilio tokens. You're not checking in any tokens and config files. You're not accidentally checking them into a secrets config file. You're going into your Azure Key Vault. So it's an Azure resource, and you can create your secrets there. You can use their API to put your secrets in there. That's fine. And the only reason why I mention it is because this is a great way to store things outside of your code and store it securely. And then you can set permissions as to who can access those keys and who can add more keys or change those keys or just read those keys. So read or read write, all those permissions and things, that's all a talk in and of itself. I was looking at the Azure Key Vault docs probably 2-3 years ago, and that's where I heard about this thing called default Azure credential. So Key Vault, they have a walkthrough on how you can work with it, and it mentioned this default Azure credential thing, and I'm like, what is that? Now again, going with the config files, nah, you don't want to deal with the plain text. You don't want to store stuff encrypted with the salt or with a way to decrypt your quote unquote encrypted values. And then if you push your secrets into the public repo or a private repo with the wrong hands, you're in more trouble. You just don't want to do that. All right, so Azure Key Vault, you can store your secrets there. You can access it there. They have an API there. Again, I'm not going to go in depth with the Key Vault because that's not the star of the show tonight. I do mention that you can look at the secret values from within the portal. So you can see that this is not my password. So the other thing you can manage with it is you can manage your Key Vault permission access 2 different ways. So they have access policies, which allows you to get into some of the details of setting what users are accessing it. If you do not have role-based access control enabled. If you have role-based access control enabled, then use the access control permissions. Now, when I created my Key Vault on my own account, I didn't have the ability to see the keys, and I didn't have the ability to manage the secrets. I can create the resource, but in order to see what's inside, I have to have specific permissions. So that's why you see in the screenshot, Key Vault Secrets Officer, is so that I could actually be showing you what is a secret and how it works inside. So be aware when you create a Key Vault, you may not necessarily have that permission off the top of your start. Okay, so alternative to user credentials. So you don't want to actually use usernames and passwords because the chance of leaking those, you've got config files, you've got even an Azure Key Vault. You're like, oh, I don't want the person accidentally getting the username and password. They shouldn't, but you don't have to necessarily use usernames and passwords, but there are things like managed identities, which is the star of our show tonight in terms of securing things, X509 certificates, and service principals. Now, X509 certificates and service principals do involve things like secret IDs, usernames, and passwords. So we're not going to demo those because they aren't passwordless. But I'll point out where they end up getting used because they are part of the Azure identity things. But managed identities, this is the star of the show. Managed identities are a way for you to have access between Azure resources. So in the demo that I'm going to show, it's an Azure Cosmos DB and an Azure App Service. We're not going to be storing a username and a password anywhere, but I do enter usernames and passwords at some point for running it locally. I don't have to do that in production. So we'll go through the process there so you can see that. But this is as long as they're using what used to be known as Azure AD is now known as Microsoft Entra ID. So this is where the managed identities, this is where the service principals, this is where the 509 certificates are stored. It's in Microsoft Entra ID. With managed identities, this is the resource has an identity for itself. So in this example, I'm going to show that the Azure App Service has an identity. And then we'll give the Azure App Service access to Cosmos. You can use this in role-based access control assignment. So whenever you see an access control IAM on a resource, you can assign the managed identity that way. It's no extra cost. It's already part of Azure. Now, there are two different types of managed identities. There's system assigned and user assigned. System assigned, what I love most about it is the fact that it is tied directly to the resource. What that means is that when that resource is gone, those identities are gone. You don't have to go back into Microsoft Entra ID and remember to delete a user or a principal. You don't have to remember to remove certificates. None of that is an issue because at managed identity, you delete that resource, it will already, the resource will pull off the system assigned identity. Now, that said, it's just for that resource. If you need all of the resources to have a shared identity for some reason, they can, but that would be a user assigned identity then rather than a system assigned. And that way you can assign it to one or more instances of an Azure service. So if you're dealing with multiple instances of a service and need to have it with the same identity for each of those instances, that's when you have to look at the user assigned. For the demo tonight, we will take a look at an app service with the system assigned managed identity. Now, the other downfall with the user assigned is, so you have all these different resources that need it. When you delete those resources, if that's the last resource that's using that identity, the resource will be deleted, but that identity will not. So you'll have to remember to go back into Microsoft Entra ID and delete it. So you could have hanging IDs out there. Happens more often than not. I was working on a project for a client, and we were setting up some things with managed identities and service principals. And I remember as I was tearing it back down, I told the Azure manager, I'm like, hey, by the way, I need you to remove this service principal. I don't have access to that. And they're like, nobody remembers to tell us about service principals. I'm like, I talk on these things, so don't forget your service principals when the user assigned managed identities. All right, now with that said, not all of the platforms support managed identities. When I did this talk over a year ago, there were some services that were kind of spotty. Those have gotten better. They've added new services. For as often as I've done this talk throughout the past, what, 2 years, this list keeps growing, which is great to see. This Azure services that can use managed identities to access other services. Azure Key Vault, so if you end up doing a search for default Azure credential with Azure Key Vault, it'll get you to a tutorial that walks you through how you can access Azure Key Vault from your code using the Azure identity thing I'm going to show here in a little bit. So I always point that out. Azure App Service I'll show tonight. Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Data Factory just happen to be some other ones that we've seen. 509 certificates for authentication. So I don't have a demo for this. The last time I did this demo was with Azure AD, and I have not looked at the changes enough to trust it for a demo. But Microsoft Entra IDs got a certificate-based authentication. There aren't any password secrets. There are secrets, client secrets, but not password secrets. The X509 certificates, when you set them up, it can be a little strange, but there's this link I include, which is how to configure the certificate-based authentication. And I have followed their instructions before, step by step. Makes life a lot easier to have that, because you do have to set up a CA, a certificate authority. You have to set up both the authentication binding and the user binding policies. And then you have to enable certificate-based authentication, that feature. Now, that said, all that's set up for a service that is, again, there for no additional cost. It's available in every edition of Microsoft Entra. So 509 certificates are a thing, but just understand that there's a lot of setup. Service principals. So service principals are similar to managed identities. Managed identities actually are a service principal. There's what they call the application service principals, managed identities, and then the legacy ones, which are created, they were known as app registrations in Azure AD. Managed identity and application service principals are the two more common ones that you'll see, unless you're still dealing with a migration from a Azure AD or even a AD on-prem to Azure. The application service principals are created in Microsoft Entra ID through the app registrations. When you create an app registration, it will create a service principal for that app registration. So the service principal is a separate thing that gets tied. It's the identity for your application. So the service principals, they have usernames and passwords. They have IDs. They can be used in role-based assignments as well. But I'm not going to have the demo for that again because it's not passwordless. I do have that managed identity though. Now with service principal notes, just to be aware that so we use Azure CLI a lot in our demos. And so I have the AZAD, the SP for service principal, and then I specifically am going to create it to be used with role-based access control because that's what I use in my Azure. It makes sense to do that. You're going to see that it says not all service principals have application objects. There was a way to be able to create those without, but for the most part, you'll typically create an app registration and it will create the service principal for you. You'll see here it talks about roles and subscription IDs. Then when you run that, this is the kind of output you get. This is where you have to pay attention. This is where I mentioned like client IDs and secrets and tenant IDs, because these names that I'm using, I'll grab my laser pointer. So these names here, like Azure _ client _ ID, service _ principal _ name. These are very specific variable names that I'm using because we'll mention them here when we get into talking about environment variables. So whenever you create a service principal for using with Azure Identity, you want to make note for these particular fields, what the values are, and store them in environment variables with these particular names. All caps, underscores where they're at. The service principal name is usually within curly braces. So those curly braces are just to show the placeholder for that particular thing. But the environment variable is specifically service _ principal _ name. All caps. It looks for the all caps. So very deliberate. Okay. So service principals, managed identities, your own accounts. How do you know what to use when you're writing your code? If you have Azure resources and you want your Azure resources to be able to work with each other, what's going on? How do you deal with all this stuff? So let's talk about this. Let's say you want to develop an app locally. Well, if you're running locally, you can do a couple things. So you could do application service principal. So that's creating that service principal that I mentioned a couple slides back with the AZADSP, you can create a service principal, that's fine. In which case you'll see that we use the environment variables to store those values. Or running locally, you could use your developer account through things like Visual Studio Code, Azure CLI, Azure PowerShell. The newer versions also have the Azure Developer PowerShell, I think was the last one that they recently added. But we'll take a look. We have the hierarchy that they use. So local development, you're going to want to go one of two ways. You want to either go application service principal or developer account. Personally, I'm going to recommend the developer account because the passwords that are involved for that, you enter it either through your Visual Studio, your VS Code, or the CLI. You're not going to be storing those credentials anywhere else, so that's fine. You're not committing your credentials to code or running the risk of storing those credentials to code. Application service principal, environment variables. You got to remember to use those wherever they're getting deployed. Now, when you're going from local to deployed, are you going on-prem or are you going to Azure? If you're developing for on-prem app service principal, you can still use with the environment variables. But if you're getting an application that's getting deployed to Azure and it's supported for managed identities, then go the route of managed identities. And that will use the managed identity to handle the permissions. A managed identity, we get to see the ID. We don't know the credentials behind it. Who knows that? Microsoft Entra ID. That platform knows it, but we don't. Now, let's talk about the code part. So looking at Azure Identity SDK for .NET, you're going to see references to Java, to JavaScript, and to Python probably throughout the slides. And that's because normally when I do this, I show this to groups that have different languages. But tonight I wanted to focus on strictly the .NET stuff, except in one of the stories. All right, so let's talk about some key concepts. I want to go ahead and zoom in on these. So there are 3 classes that you need to be familiar with when working with Azure Identity. There's token credential, the abstract base class. There's default Azure credential, which is a story in and of itself. And then there's chain token credential, which is the one I highly recommend. And we'll see why that is. But you'll notice they all, of course, come from object. Now, token credential, so first things first with token credential, is that this is the base. All token credentials provide OAuth tokens. Now you're thinking probably, oh great, OAuth, this is going to be authorization and exchanging tokens. This is going to be a headache, isn't it? No. I'll show you the code so you can see it's really not that awful. They've taken away a lot of the work that we have to do. Now you're seeing lots of arrows, and that's just because there are a lot of different classes that derive from the token credential class. So we're not going to go through each one individually. I do mention some of these later, but think of it this way. If you have a developer command line tool for Azure, it's probably got its own token credential type. If you're using VS Code or Visual Studio, it's got credential types as well. The client stuff, that's the X509 certificates. The device code, you know those URLs where you have to go and enter in a code. So you go to the URL, enter the code so that your Xbox, for example, can access something. That's the device code. On behalf of is another one that's on the next slide, where you get a consent prompt and are you allowed to access this on behalf of somebody else. So we have various different types of credentials. There's a shared token cache credential that was used before. Username and password credential. So you can use username and password. So this Azure, the default Azure credential and the chain token credentials I'm going to show you are not strictly passwordless, but the demo I'm showing tonight with managed identity is passwordless. So you can do username and password credentials. You can do environment variable credentials, the environment credentials, which could also contain user names and passwords and tokens. The latest one that I remember seeing on this list that I haven't done in past presentations is the workload identity credential. You see that with Kubernetes. Okay, so default Azure credential versus chain token credential. And yes, their names are merged together like that. So let's talk about the two of them. Default Azure credential. So this is what got me started talking about this topic in general in the first place. I was looking at Azure Key Vault and happened to see a default Azure credential. And I was like, what is this? Oh, authorization that looks really easy. How does this work? So default Azure credential is a predefined token chain. It's easy for getting started. Again, Azure Key Vault's tutorial made it super easy to see, and that's what made me go, ooh, what's this? And then credentials can be excluded. So default Azure credential, and we'll look at the credential chain it has, the order it looks at, because it looks at so many different credentials in a particular order. So we'll talk about that. The exclusion, though, is you have to be explicit and say, I don't want this here. So you create default credential options. Then you can say, I don't want environment variables, or, oh, I don't want the shared token cache, or whatever it is. Chain token credential, which is the one I'm going to push more for, what's nice about it is it's an empty chain that you define. You can tell it which credentials you want, and I have a couple stories for that. And then if you're dealing with production loads, chain token credential, don't use default Azure credential. Default Azure credential has so many ways that you could get in. Chain token credential, you control that. There's a granularity you have. It makes more sense for production to use chain token credential. Okay, so let's talk about these a little bit more so that you understand just what's going on here. So first, let's talk about default Azure credential. So this is part of Azure Identity. And there are demos and all sorts of SDKs with Java.NET, JavaScript, and Python. But it makes it so much easier to do Azure development without having to store the credentials and config files. And it's specifically a chain of credentials for authentication. It'll get you your OAuth token. What's nice about this is it has its predefined chain. So again, easy to get started. So these are the different credentials that are part of the default Azure credential. So what it's going to do is it's going to check first for environment variables. And we will look at what is considered an environment variable that it looks for, because there are very specific ones it looks for. If it doesn't find those environment variables, then default Azure credential is going to check workload identity and then manage identity. If it doesn't have any of these, then it's going to go down the chain until it finds something. If it doesn't find any credentials, it will fail. And I want to show you a failure message so you can see what that looks like. So I do have that here. But just so you're aware, default Azure credential checks these things in an order. And it's a very specific order that you don't control. And it checks all of these unless you exclude them. Now, the credential types. So environments, workload identities, managed identities. These you would see on the Azure side of things. So in the cloud. VS Code, the CLIs, the Azure Developer CLI. Those are all developer tools. And then the interactive browser, I don't have a demo for that, but it's if you're doing some interactive development within a web browser, you can get the credentials that way as well. All right, so these are the order of checking that we just talked about. Again, workload identity it's for Kubernetes. So that way, if you need to specify the identity in its way of acting, that's what it is there. The interactive browser shell, just so you can see, so that's a browser prompt, but it is not enabled by default. So if you wanted to get that far and you want to use the interactive browser, you have to explicitly turn that one on. Otherwise, these other credentials, and we're not going to go through these exhaustingly, but we will talk about them briefly. But before we talk about them, let's talk about failure. People are like, oh no, you're talking about failure. Don't tempt them. It's okay. Failure is something I actually enjoy talking about because as developers, are things always happy path? No. Do we run into errors? Oh yeah. What did 5 minutes ago me do wrong this time? is usually the case. I mean, this is what we do. So I was doing this, preparing for this talk way back when, a couple years ago, and was running a Python demo, and managed to run into an issue. And it was one of those, you're in the hotel room the night before the talk and running through, making sure demos look okay. And I was running my Python demo, and it was not coming up. And I'm like, what's going on? But to see this stack trace, now the stack trace here has bullets so that I can call out things. But first of all, it's readable. I was excited to see that. And I was actually happy to see what went wrong. So you can see the chain for default Azure credential and it checking its things. So we didn't have workload at that point. So that's why it's not here in the attempted credentials, but you can see it checks environment credentials. Nothing there that it could see. If we were expecting it to be picking up environment variables, look, they give us a URL to actually go check and see. And that URL works. The managed identity credential, well, it couldn't find the managed identity, so that's not good, which is fine. This particular demo wasn't relying on that. Shared token cache credential, that is no longer part of the chain, so you don't need to worry about that. That was a part of the chain in this case. Visual Studio Code credential. So when I work in languages other than C#, I typically are Visual Studio Code. Sometimes I'm in Visual Studio Code for C#, sometimes I'm in VS, the full IDE. Tonight will be VS Code. But this is what I really appreciated. It showed that the refresh token expired due to inactivity. So I now understand, oh, my token expired. Okay, fine. Fire off another AZ login, get a new token, and then I was able to run my code. So to have an error message that not only shows the chain in action, but also has recommendations on what to look for with URLs that actually work and take us to things other than reference documentation, the user experience behind Azure Identity, I can't rave about it enough and how awesome it is. So default Azure credential, great for getting started with the OAuth, with the chain. Again, the interactive browser, if you want to include it, it needs to be included explicitly. The default Azure credential options, if you prefer PowerShell or if you prefer Azure CLI, you can just exclude the other one. That's fine. When you're dealing with default Azure credential, you can say, oh, I don't need these. But remember that this is explicit exclusion. By default, there's a long list of inclusion. You can override your tenant ID. So if you're in a multi-tenant situation, you need to explicitly set the tenant ID. What else do we have in here? The user assigned identities. So managed identity is assumed as system assigned. However, you need to include client ID if you're doing user assigned identities. And then by default, this is the public cloud. When people are like, but cloud? Government cloud's a different story. So if you have government cloud or a different cloud, there are a couple other exceptions to public cloud. You can set your authority host as part of the default Azure credential options. So I know there's a government option, I think it was a China option, a couple others as well. So if you are on something other than the standard Azure public cloud, just remember you'll have to set your authority host. Okay, so remember the slide a few slides back, we were talking about service principals. When you create that service principal, there were specific values, and they had all these underscores in their names, and I was telling you how very specifically those are specific IDs. This is because this is the environment credential. So this is having environment variables with these very specific names. Client ID, client secret, tenant ID. Those were on the slide for the service principal. The client certificate path, the send certificate chain, those are all related to X509s. Username and password, you could see in a couple of different credentials. Environment credential is the one that's going to be the one checking for them specifically, but you can also tell it with the username and password credential. And then this Azure Authority Host, this is what I was talking about, where if you're not on the public cloud, but on one of the other Azure clouds, you set this Azure _ authority _ host to whatever your cloud is, and there are cloud codes online. So the environment credential is good for things like that. So general credentials, that's why I said like the username and passwords, X509s, service principals have a few more fields too. So that's where environment credentials happen. If you remember a couple slides back, we talk about running locally versus in production. So if you have production on premises, then you could consider the environment credential. Running locally, you could use the environment credential for that as well. If you're like, but what if I want to use environment credential in dev, but I want to use manage identity in prod? Sit tight, I gotcha, I promise you. Managed identities. So these are what I strongly recommend when you're working with Azure resources that are talking to each other. I forgot to update this slide apparently. So it's managed in not Azure Active Directory. It's now known as Microsoft Entra ID. So that's where managed identities are managed. However, if you're dealing with system assigned managed identities, those are managed on the resource that you're assigning them to. There's no need to store any credentials. You can't even access the managed identities credentials. There's no extra cost. And just so you can see my managed identities, I'm going to go back to my Passwordless demo resource group. And I have my app service. And I have this set up so that the app service can talk to Azure Cosmos DB. And it's using its managed identities. So typically along the left-hand side in Azure portal, at least as of today, under settings, there's a section called identity. Now you can do this from the Azure CLI as well, but you can see in here under identity, you can do system assigned or user assigned. And because I wanted to keep it simple, and because I wanted it to not have to manage my identity, I went with system assigned. That way, when I delete this at the end of the night, what's going to happen is those system assigned identities will go away with the resources. They're not going to leave a hanging user assigned identity for me to then remember to go back and fix. So this is where the identity is. This ID field here would show the ID in its general GUID form. So that's how you set up the identity for your managed identity for a resource. Typically it's under settings, then there's identity, and you can go from there. Okay, so that's managed identities. Now when it comes to developer credentials, so there's the IDE ones. So Visual Studio Code, when you log into them, those store your credentials. So you can use the IDE's integration with the Azure credentials and use that to access. Or if you're doing PowerShell or your Azure CLI, so me doing the AZ commands everywhere, I use Azure CLI, but you can use PowerShell as well. You can also use the Azure Developer CLI, that's a new one. Then if you want to use the interactive browser, just know that this has to be enabled by default. Yeah, it has to be enabled. It is not enabled by default. You have to enable it if you want to use it. Okay, so that's default. Let's talk about chained. Chained is where I recommend for production, and chained is actually nowadays where I start with. But that's because I've used default so much that I'm just like, I don't need all of those credentials. It's that principle that we have as developers where you ain't gonna need it. Do you really need all those credential checks? Or do you know what credentials you wanna work with? Chain token credentials, so they're chain credentials. You get the chain, you get to define the chain. And it can inherit from any of the token credentials, including the ones that are out of the box available. In addition to all the ones that are included in default Azure credential. And if you have your own custom token credential, I don't have a good use case for it, but you may have a case for it. As long as it inherits from token credential, you could add that into the chain credentials as well. So the chain token credential chains, let's talk about what those look like. So you saw the really long list I had for default Azure credential. Chain token credentials, they don't need to be that long. So maybe you you're a developer who uses multiple tools, you're constantly having to change contexts. So maybe you want to include all the developer credentials plus then manage identity for production. So you include all of your developer ones, include your Visual Studio, your VS Code, Azure CLI, PowerShell. You may have that as your default chain token credential. That happens. You got my sympathy. I understand constantly changing contexts and having all the different tools available. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe you are strictly Visual Studio, PowerShell for development, and then managed identity is your deployment. Now I'm listing them so they did cloud first and then developer checks. When I'm developing, I try to do developer first, and that's just because that's what I look at. But you can change that order before you deploy, if that makes sense. Now, this is what I do typically, and that's just because I'm between languages and different platforms. So I'll use VS Code and Azure CLI and managed identity. Probably noticing a trend here, managed identity for production. And then there's, of course, the chain token credential that I'm going to show tonight, which is Azure CLI and managed identity. So I'm not even getting into the IDEs, just take me to the command line. All right, before I get into the demos, any questions while I'm still here in the slides? And I can see the chat, so if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. If you don't want to come off mute, that's fine. Okay. Well then, I am going to then go into demo. So the demo I want to show tonight is a creature catalog. It is blogged about, so this is a series I did last December, and I have since gone through and updated the posts because technology changes over the year. And so you can see step by step what we need to do to get there. But we're going to create a holiday creatures catalog where we're storing the data in Azure Cosmos DB for the NoSQL API. And then we're calling to that database from the Azure App Service without any credentials. Okay, let me go ahead and flip over to my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go to VS Code. I'm going to close those up a minute so we can take a tour of what we've got. So these applications are documented in the blog post. I will make sure that Joe has the links for these and that Sam has the links for these. I will post links in Meetup afterwards, and then I'm sure that Sam will include the links in YouTube post as well, so when the video is live. But just so you can see what we have, so we have a console application, and in that console application, I have a CSV file. I don't need another CSV plugin. So this CSV file is just the creature, the description, and whether they're naughty or nice. So getting in the mood for the holidays again, from all different cultures. So that's what this is the data that we're going to load into the database. I have a creature object. It is using Newtonsoft JSON for that JSON property of ID. Otherwise, there's really not much going on in my creature, other than the empty constructor and then the ability to initialize that name and description. I'd like to show this part as no tricks up my sleeve. The Cosmos helper, this is where you want to see what's going on. So my Cosmos helper, I do use an environment variable to store my Cosmos URI, so accessing the database via URI rather than any other way. You could, if you wanted, store this in Azure Key Vault, but I'm fine with the environment variable. My database name, container name, and partition key, these are for the Azure Cosmos DB setup. I have a database setup called Holiday Creatures, and it's got a creatures container, and it's got a partition key of ID. I did not close it, so let's go back just so you can see. Again, no tricks up my sleeve. Azure Cosmos DB account. I'm going to go to my Data Explorer, and I'm going to go into my creatures and go to my items. So you can see that I have all these items, creature 1 through wherever. I got loaded from my CSV file with a bunch of, like, the underscore file fields are specific to Cosmos DB. Those are nothing we included, but ID, name, description, and is naughty are our fields. So this is what we're looking at in terms of data. Now, could I have done this in SQL Server? Sure. Or Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres, or maybe Postgres or MySQL? Sure, your database choice. Azure Cosmos DB happened to be the one that I chose. All right, back to VS Code. So I am using the Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos package. I am also using the Azure.Identity package. You can see here, so we have the versions captured. I'm using version 3.36.4.0 for the Microsoft Azure Cosmos, then 1.star for Azure.Identity, which is at 1.10.3, if I remember reading that earlier today. My CS project here shows 8.0, so I can run this locally, but it doesn't matter if it's 8.0 or 7.0 or 6.0. I've done this demo on all three of those. The code has not changed at all along the way. The Cosmos helper, so that's the Cosmos setup. This is where we take a look at this chain token credential. So the Cosmos helper is going to create a new client. It's going to go to the URI, and it needs a token credential, our chain token credential. The reason why we're using that is I don't want to have to use the environment variables for usernames and passwords. Though the URI I'm okay with. Usernames and passwords, I don't like those being stored in environment variables. Just doesn't sit well with me. And so, okay, well, what does work for me? So I'm going to create a new chain token credential. And when I create that new chain token credential, this order defines the order for checking. So it's going to check first my Azure CLI. If it doesn't find an Azure CLI credential, then it's going to try the managed identity credential. So it's going to check just those two. Now, that said, I could just say use default Azure credential and then let it do the whole chain. But once you know how default Azure credential checks a long chain and you know where your credentials are coming from, chain token credential makes a lot more sense. So again, it's a matter of having that Microsoft Azure Cosmos for the client part, but Azure.Identity, that's what's doing this chain token credential. Now this code I ran earlier today, so I'm not going to run it again, but I want to show you just what's going on. This is going to get a database. If a database doesn't exist, it's going to go ahead and create it. It's going to then create that container if it doesn't exist. Then it's going to load the data. So if we go into program.cs, you can see that, okay, we're going to use our Cosmos helper, and we're going to have it do the container. I have a function that calls get creatures, and so that's going to load the CSV. Speaking of VB references that Joe had mentioned earlier, is that still here? There it is. So you may be like, wait a minute, sir, you're doing C#. Yes. But why does it say using Microsoft Visual Basic up there? I always have to point that out. Microsoft Visual Basic File I/O makes it a lot easier for us to read through the CSV and to access it and to deal with it the way we're handling it here. So if you're like, why does it say Visual Basic? It's because that particular library makes sense for how we're parsing through.
And I'd like to add that there is no shame in using Visual Basic libraries.
No, this is where it helps to have that knowledge, because then you realize, oh, it could be a lot easier sometimes. No shame at all. I love Visual Basic. Even if my brain doesn't always remember the VB.NET stuff, it still holds that special place. So when I saw this Microsoft Visual Basic File I/O to process CSVs, I was just like, I can't say no. So this is going to load the CSV into that. Yep. Yeah, Rich mentions he uses the VB Financial Functions library all the time. Those libraries are so helpful. And the fact that we can use them in C#, even better. So yeah, this will loop through all of the creatures that we put in the list, and then it's going to go ahead and add that item into Azure Cosmos DB. And I showed you my Azure Cosmos DB to show you no tricks up my sleeve. They did get loaded. In fact, you can see here, this is how the creature ID got populated. Why you see creature 1, 2, 3. It's because of us actually setting that value. Okay, so that's the console app. I use the console app specifically to load the data. And again, the console app means I'm not deploying this to Azure. So technically, I could have just passed it the Azure CLI. But I wanted to show what happens with the chain token credential in terms of syntax. The web app, that's where magic happens. So I'm going to collapse that and close my program CS. And let's look at the web app. This is just a .NET new web app, so nothing fancy. I try to keep my demos as simple as can be, just so that we go straight to the point. Unless I'm dealing with the architecture talks or the design pattern talks that I do, I very rarely get into super in-depth and complicated demos. All right, so this is what we have as our web app. We have our program CS. You'll notice, hey, this looks very familiar. Nothing gets changed here at all, but this is to show you the boilerplate is, this is your default website. The things that do happen, so I have this models folder. There's that creature model. Now, technically speaking, I could have this in a solution in Visual Studio with the console app as a project, web app as a project, and a shared library for the creature. I could get away with that, but I didn't go that route because I was already in VS Code for other things today. So it was just like, I want to stay in VS Code. I didn't feel like dealing with solutions and projects and all that. So that's why it's repeated. But yes, I could have done that as a shared class and that would have been fine. I did run into some issues where I wasn't using Newtonsoft JSON. I tried using system.text.json with the JSON property name, and it was throwing all sorts of errors. So I was like, I'm going to back up and go back to Newtonsoft JSON. I didn't want to get into debugging others' code, not today. So that's why if you're like, why is she using Newtonsoft.json and not system.text.json? It's because I ran into issues and wasn't going to debug it at that point. And again, for those watching the recording, the issue I ran into, so I had JSON property name with system.text.json, and it went kaboom when I tried to access it in Azure Cosmos DB. All right, so that's models. The other folder that I had at this point was services. And really, it's not a service. These are helpers. But I have the Cosmos helper. And again, this could have also just been part of a shared project because of that chain token credential. Now, in this one, you can see I'm doing a new Azure CLI credential, a new managed identity credential. I could put other credentials in there if I really wanted to. But again, I like to keep it simple. I like to keep it so it's only checking the credentials I would use, not the ones that I might use. You ain't gonna need it really just rings true in here. So as long as you have a token credential of some sort, you could pass that there. Chain token credential, again, makes it easier for you to code once and then be able to run it in dev and run it in prod, not have to change like, if is development, do this thing, otherwise do this other thing. Who likes writing that code? If is development. Oh, previous me did that a lot, but when I can get around that, it's a beautiful thing. So Cosmos Helper, this is the same one that we used for console. Creature Helper, just so you can see what's going on with that. So Creature Helper is another helper class. It does rely on the Cosmos Helper. And what this is doing is it's running this query, select star from creatures, against the Cosmos DB, and it's getting it into what they call a feed iterator. So instead of reading it into a list and then iterating on the list, we'll just loop through the feed, and as we go through it, check to see, okay, does it have more results? This is to show how the feed works with the feed iterator and the feed response in Cosmos. So then we're going to read from Cosmos, and then we're going to take our creatures and we're going to store them. So we'll return creatures from this creature helper and we'll store them outside of here. All right, so we have our two helpers. The other change I have, so the model, the two helpers, I'm going to go into pages and into the index HTML, index CS HTML CS, so you can see what's going on there. We have this list of creatures. It's public, which means we're going to be working on that in the front end. When we hit the onGet, this is where we call the creature helper, get all the creatures async, and then put it into a list. So that then on the index side of things, we can loop through that and display that. So if I run this locally, this should be calling out to my Azure Cosmos DB. This should be using my Azure CLI, and then it should go ahead and load the values. Now I'm going to bring up my terminal. I'm going to clear it. Okay, so I'm going to do my AZ login now. So we know that the Azure CLI has been logged in. And we're going there. So I've been logged in. Close that. Okay, so we are logged in there. Clear that. Okay, so now that I'm logged in, I'm going to do is cd into the web app and .NET run. Okay, so now it's telling me that it's running locally. Open the browser. Oh, I didn't store my environment variable in there. Okay. Let me pull that off screen. Let me pause this a minute. And we'll take a look at getting the Cosmos URI environment variable. That happens. So $env, and the URI is on the key screen, and I did update the blog post today. The reason I had to do that is because they changed that screen. Microsoft changing an Azure screen? I know I don't say, but I do say. Because they used to have the URI under the read-write keys and read-only keys headings, and now it's pulled above that. So if you followed this series before and then you try to run it nowadays and you're like, this doesn't line up, I've fixed that. All right, so let me tell this to .NET Run and I will resume my screen sharing here. You ever have that moment where Visual Studio Code goes to run something in the terminal and you're like, this doesn't look right because that text you're typing on looks like it's getting typed all over your previous stuff in the terminal? Where's that? There we go. Okay. So you should see right now it is running. And so if I go to localhost 5082, you'll see there's holiday creatures. These are going right to the Cosmos DB using my AZCLI login. So the only username and password I have to do is whatever AZ login asks me to do. So I've got that. Now again, localhost. So that's how you know I'm running locally. Now, what if we want to run this in Azure? I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So what I did earlier today is I followed my blog post step by step, updated the steps where they didn't match. So fixing the environment variable so that Cosmos URI gets pushed out through part of the AZ CLI. And once you have that set up, so let me pull up my Azure. I'm going to pull up my Azure App Service. And I want to pull up in there the configuration, just so you can see. And so you should see the Passwordless demo resource group, the Holiday Creatures app. So we are in the app, within the app service plan. So we're on the app service. There's my Cosmos URI environment variable. So that I was okay storing as an environment variable. But you'll notice in here, I don't have any other environment variables for like usernames and passwords. So you're probably wondering, how did this connect over to Azure Cosmos DB? And it's through this identity. There it goes. Okay. So this is the Azure App Service talking to Azure Cosmos DB. I had to create custom roles because at the time there weren't the custom roles for read-only and rewrite access to Azure Cosmos DB. So the blog post series will walk through how you create those, what docs I use to create those, and the actual JSON files I use to create those, and how we assign them. So just be aware that we create custom roles in Azure Cosmos DB for read and read-write access. But my console app had read-write access. My web app has read-write access because of the console app, because I'm using that same chain token credential. But my identity for my managed identity is read-only, which means I can't write, I can't load, I can't do any changes to this. It is purely read-only. So again, this is just an app that's calling data from Azure App Service to, or on Azure App Service calling to Azure Cosmos DB using managed identity, no passwords in our code. We tell it that we want the Azure CLI. We tell it that we want the managed identity, but our passwords are not getting stored in our code. This is crucial when you're dealing with Azure development. I'm sure you'll run into this when you're just starting out, but hopefully by this point, you're just starting to see that you don't need to include credentials in your code when you're dealing with Azure to Azure resources. All right. And I'll make sure to include a link to the blog post series. That's what this link is here. Okay, so there are other demos. Again, we're right now about 15 minutes left, so not enough time to show all these other demos, but just so you're aware that this shows Azure App Service and Azure Spring Apps, which is the Java cloud. Notice that we've got the reference to the quick start for Azure Key Vault secret client library. So the Azure Key Vault secrets, if you do a search for it on the C# side or .NET side, you will see the same thing. That's where I learned about default Azure credentials. So that's what got me all excited about this in the first place. Python, again, you saw the error and the fail of the chain. Those were through the Python SDK. And the documentation there is great. And I do include the troubleshoot because, again, the failure in the chain, it was just great to see how that works. Of course, I would not forget our friend C#. So the Azure Identity Client Library for .NET is part of the Azure for .NET SDK. But you just got to remember to add references to the packages when you need them. And then there's that Azure Key Vault quick start that I was referring to that got me started with this whole, this looks really cool. This was way too easy. What is this default Azure credential? And so this was what led me down the rabbit hole. And since then, chain token credential is new to this talk, but this is one I blog about, and this is one that I really just am excited to show because you have that granularity. You have that control. Now, there are other resources out there. So when it comes to authentication in the Azure SDK, there's a great blog post. There's also, if you're dealing with Azure Key Vault and secrets, there's a developer's guide. I include the Key Vault stuff because, again, if you're working with secrets, you don't want to store any of that. Usernames, passwords, tokens, anything proprietary and you don't want people to be snooping into, store it in Key Vault. Don't put it in a config file. People find it in configs. They can't get into your Key Vault if it's secured properly. And again, this isn't just related to .NET. You can do this with Java, JavaScript, and Python for your default Azure credential class and the chain token credentials as well. And if you have any questions about getting started with this, feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'm still Sadukie. LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Sadukie. Blue Sky, if you do a search for Sadukie, you'll find me there. Mastodon, I'm on Hackederm as Sadukie there as well.
Hey, Sarah, this is Joe. I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask, and I think it's useful to talk about this in particular. A lot of times in a production environment, enterprise environment, your interactions with Azure are based on scheduled tasks, right? You're not necessarily interactive.
Yep.
So how does that change things? How do you provide the credentials at the beginning? You know, you showed logging interactively when you're in a scheduled task environment.
So when you're in a scheduled task environment, are you talking running it locally, or are you talking you're running these like web jobs or functions or something up there?
Typically, it would be a dedicated task server or job server in a corporate environment.
Okay, so if you're talking running them then locally, then when whatever code you're writing for, you're going to use something like the environment credential, and then setting those specific environment variable names. So even though it's not running in Azure, you still have to use the Azure underscore username and Azure underscore password or whatever the specific fields are. You still have to use those specific names. But you can run, if it's going to be accessing a resource over Azure, then use environment credentials, probably going to be the best one for running locally or on-prem.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, because that's normally how we interact. We run things through, you know, basically a batch server, but you know, it's really just a dedicated machine running the Windows Task Server in our case.
Yeah, and that's why I asked if it was on-prem or cloud, because if you were doing something where you're doing scheduling like Azure Batch, and so you're doing it in the cloud, then it's Azure to Azure, in which case then it's like, okay, now looking to manage identities for that. But because you're running it on-prem, that's why I say something like the environment credential would make the most sense.
Okay. And then I just, not a question, but I want to add, I have been working with the Azure Key Vault a little bit, and I want to mention that the Azure Key Vault has two modes to it. There is a software key mode and there's a hardware key mode. Now, so the software key mode, as you can imagine, is based on encryption, and that's essentially free, and you get so many calls a month that I've never even come close to approaching any kind of cost. But they also have a hardware mode, which does cost more, but the hardware mode is actually backed up by physical hardware at the Microsoft computing, data center. That's the word I was looking for.
Yep.
And that would be for when you really, really need security, right? And maybe you're in the government cloud and you want to have enhanced security. Maybe you're a financial institution, but know that if you are in a environment where you're under federal requirements to have a hardware key-based encryption, you can still do that in Azure.
Yep.
So that could be important to know in certain situations. So I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah.
But Sarah, I'll tell you, we are in our use right now. We're still pretty early in our use of the Azure Key Vault, and we use the default credential. And I had no idea it was checking so many places. And before we started this conversation, before we started the session, even today, I complained that it was slow. Like, okay, thank you, Sarah. Now I know why it might actually be slow.
Exactly. And for me, this talk had evolved from I think default Azure credential is so cool. I want to show it to you all okay, I want to show it to you all, but there's another option. And it was one of those, when I first did the presentation, they were just like, hey, by the way, after the fact, after I delivered it, I was talking with some folks and they're like, do you know about chain token credential? I'm like, no, what's chain token credential? And when I saw what that was, I'm like, you know, I'm changing my talk because default Azure credential is cool. It's easy to set up, but like you're running into, it checks a lot of different credentials. And if you're
Right.
doing calls to Azure Key Vault for multiple keys and it's checking the credentials for each one of those, that's probably where you're running into some problems. So
Right.
yeah, check into chain token credential and use only the credentials that you need to. So
Right.
if you're running locally and calling out to it, then you might have to do the environment credential. The environment credential, you probably are going to use a service principal to then access the key vault and to access from your on-prem environment to your cloud. So you
Yes.
create an app registration in Microsoft Entra ID. And when you create that app registration, the app registration can then create the service principal for you.
Right. And as you mentioned in the talk, if you're in a production environment, that's a repetitive batch job, you
Yeah,
know where you're going to get your credentials. So just go ahead and get them from there.
exactly. When you know what credentials you might be working with, or that you know for sure you're working with in dev or you're working with in production, then build your chain specifically for just those credentials. Keep in mind that developer principle we like to use, which is YAGNI. You ain't gonna need it. Only include what you need.
Mm, very good tip. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I
Awesome.
think that is it, right?
Mhm.
In the chat is the link to Sarah's or the link to our form to be able to provide Sarah feedback on her talk. I would highly recommend or request even that you complete that so that Sarah has some feedback for her talk. Um, and Sarah, I want to thank you very much for taking some time out post Halloween to do
Mhm.
this. Um, and when I saw the talk, the subject of the talk, and I saw that we were going to have some scheduling issues and not be able to do it on a regular time, I looked at the talk and I thought, I don't want to miss this one. We need to do something to get this one in here because I don't want to miss it.
Well, thank you
So
for accommodating me and working with the schedule conflicts. Much appreciated. This has been
no
great.
problem, no problem. I think this is wonderful, and I'm particularly grateful that we're recording this because you had a lot of information in there. And that's,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm gonna have to go watch that video because I didn't get it all down in the first pass. So
Yeah. Well, and if you want to go through the demo that I show, like I said, I will include
mhm.
a link. I'll include links in both Meetup and then we'll have Sam include it with the YouTube videos as well to the various resources because I think the blog post is 4, 5, 6, somewhere about that, like that number
Mm,
of posts where I
mhm.
break it up step by step because there's just so
Yeah,
much going on.
right. No, this is good. This is really, really good. I think that as a developer working I'm a consultant and I work with different clients, and I
Yep.
can't tell you how many times I have found, passwords in code and passwords in config files and passwords in plain text and
Oh
passwords in,
yeah.
and then they say, well, and I've had clients who say, well, we encrypt our passwords. Well, yeah, but then the password to the encryption's in your code. So really,
Exactly. That's why I have those slides where I call out things like that because we see it as consultants all the time. Being in the field for over 20 years, oh God, I've lost count of how many times I've seen that, but it's just like, we're better than this at this point.
right,
Technology has evolved. There are new
right.
solutions for us to do
Right.
this.
And I'm not knocking my clients. It's a difficult problem to solve, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's not the answer is not obvious, right? It's
right.
not
And to
in
be
front of your
fair,
face,
those were the tools that we had to work with back then.
right?
And they're not always good practices. There's a lot of
Right.
awful practices. Or like we use one user on this code, we use another user on this code, but if you ever notice, it's the same user, same and you're like, oh God, I
Right.
wish I
Right.
didn't know these things.
So this is not a in the past problem. This is a very much in the present and probably even in the
Yes.
future problem
Yes.
of managing passwords. And I don't see that we're going to be in a totally passwordless environment anytime soon. So
Slowly getting there.
and it is, and that's a good thing, but we're going to be fighting this battle for a while.
Oh,
So
absolutely. It's
I
an uphill
really,
battle, but no, you're not alone.
You are not alone. And all the craziness you see, we've all seen it.
We've seen
You're
it.
not unique either.
No, you're not unique. And this is the reason why I do this talk, is to let you know there are other options that are out there. And we should be talking about this and sharing this with our fellow coworkers so that they realize they don't need to put their passwords in config files. You can put it in a secrets file, but also make sure, don't forget to put that in the git ignore. That's something I have to push out there. Yeah, Rich is right too, is talking about how there's a lot of legacy code out there where the credentials are right there in the code or in the config files. And sometimes they're in the code in all different spots because we didn't necessarily have the clean code or clean architecture way back when. And so, yeah, it gets gross.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, definitely. So the bottom line is it's a very relevant talk,
yes.
and thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for accommodating the schedule for me. Much appreciated. Thank you all
Okay.
for it all.
All right. And for those of you on the recording, I hope you thank you for joining us, even though you weren't able to make it today. We'll see you on the third Thursday of this month. We have another one coming up, and that will be on the 15th. And I did not look to see who, so I will leave that as a mystery.
Ooh.
But we have it scheduled. We are scheduled out through February of 2024 at this point. So
Oh, that's awesome.
GlugNet is still going strong.
I love seeing that. And I will send more speakers this way. So,
Okay, appreciate it. All right,
yep.
everyone. Good night. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Sarah.